Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me here. And so what I'm going to talk about is a set of research looking at the theoretical topic of how does generating explanations help people learn, and how does receiving them. To do this, I'm also actually have a second focus, and that's on actually how can we design technology so that as behavioral scientists, we can do research in the real world, so that as computational scientists, we can actually apply algorithms to machine learning in real world contexts and make intelligent technologies. So in a way, there's actually several different kinds of contributions I'm trying to focus on in this talk. One's going to be on understanding explanation. The other is actually going to be maybe pretty different from a typical cognitive science talk, and also trying to target machine learning as well as human-computer interaction. How do we design systems at scale? So as I mentioned, there's this question of how does generating and receiving explanations help people learn? And if you want to think of an intuitive example, we often learn because other people explain to us. For example, explaining why Joe was such a great office mate to have might have convinced Karen that she should get married to him. Or even sometimes asking yourself questions like, why is Joe always spending time with Karen? Might actually help you uncover some hidden insight into their relationship, if you didn't already know them. So we're always asking explanations, we're always receiving them. Anecdotally, it's clear that they're part of our cognitive lives, but actually across a wide range of disciplines, psychology to education, philosophy, asking why is really fundamental to advancing science. And there are many algorithms in artificial intelligence that are sort of based on the idea of how we can characterize explanations. So this is the kind of question I'm interested in, and what I've done in my dissertation, and now what I'm moving forward in other areas. The dual question, which I think helps answer the first, is how can online technology enable research? So 5 or 10 years ago, data collection wasn't, most of our interactions didn't involve digital media. Once you go on a website though, or even a phone, you've actually got a mini lab in the real world. You can randomize people to different conditions, you can collect data, and these technologies can also adapt very quickly. Instead of, if you were teaching in an ordinary classroom or even giving this talk, I can give it, I can collect data, and I can give it again. But in an online setting, you can actually give multiple versions to different people, and you can actually adapt it online in real time. And so in particular, the way I focused on this issue from a human-computer interaction perspective is, how do we design technology so we can actually do psychology experiments in real-world settings, and also do experiments that look for interactions between conditions and features of users. So we don't just see what's true about people in general, but true for specific subsets of people. For computer science, how do we actually take algorithms that normally run on static data sets and actually deploy them in a website? Google's doing this to you all the time, that they're trying algorithms to experiment. How can we actually do that on our own? For education, for your department website, for your homepage. And then also, there's what are more sort of design engineering systems kinds of questions. If you give me a particular technology, like maybe social psychologists are particularly interested in online dating apps, maybe cognitive psychologists are really interested in learning, other people are interested in judgment decision making, how do we then take that piece of technology and redesign it so it becomes one of these micro labs? How do we redesign it so it becomes an intelligent agent that actually can help optimize and help people, while at the same time allowing researchers to run experiments? Okay, so this is a formalism or framework I've developed. And here's just one example of how I think it can be used. So if you think of a web page, you can visualize your department website with your happy smiling face on it. This is actually an online course. It's called a MOOC, or a Massive Open Online Course. It's not really clear how you can do research with this. What data is being collected? What can you change? Can you change anything at all? When I first started doing research in these settings, for example, with Khan Academy, whose online math exercises, with these MOOCs, even with on-campus courses, it really wasn't clear at all how I could match this real-world context with the typical laboratory paradigm. So here's the approach that I take now. So hopefully I'll spare some of you all the pain, and it'll be easier for all of you. Designate or find some component of this that's useful as a psychological paradigm. For example, here's a math problem. in a lot of ways, this actually looks a lot like a category learning task. Someone gets a math problem, they enter an answer, they get feedback on it. That's sort of analogous to you see an example of an item, and you say whether it's A or B, and you get feedback on that. Then we might actually start to manipulate features of this problem. For example, in this problem, you get the statement, you might type an answer and see if it's right or wrong. Then actually you get an explanation of how to solve the problem, either to help you if you are struggling, or even after you've already gotten the answer, to reinforce that knowledge. So what if we take something like that explanation and turn it into something like a modular microlab? Well, let's say we took that explanation, which is up right now, and we redesigned it so that basically any one of you in this room could actually suggest alternative explanations. So you can see practically how that might be useful. But scientifically, what it's now allowing you to do is look at a resource and see, well, here's the independent variable I can change. Is there some way that I can take the set of scientific questions I have, let's say it's 100, 1,000 for those of you who are brilliant, and align that with the set of practical questions that this person wants to answer? What's the intersection of experimental conditions that will help me answer some hypothesis and help some instructor improve their learning? So then you can actually propose these different versions, and you can actually dynamically add in these conditions. So even if it launches like this, or launches with 2 or 3, you can just keep adding them in, because over time you've got a constant stream of participants coming through. Now, in terms of how these are delivered, well, you could always associated with each of these sort of modular components is going to be some data about users. It can come from other parts of the website, or even that component itself. For example, what was their learning performance before? Some kind of pretest. How have they filled out certain survey questions? And now the final component of this is actually specifying some policy. And when I say policy here, I'm using the way reinforcement learning or computer scientists do, some systematic way of delivering different versions or different conditions that's either based on a variable that's set randomly or based on a feature of users. So then a randomized policy is basically what we always do. We assign people with equal probability to every condition. This is kind of the maximal, so this is the statistically most efficient way to figure out if there are differences between conditions. In a computer science context, you would think of this as exploration. On the other hand, there are all kinds of other policies that we might change dynamically. And in particular, that an instructor who you're collaborating with might require you to change, or that a machine learning researcher would be interested in exploring. These would be called exploitation policies. So the idea is that if you want to figure out what's working, if you're an agent exploring the world, you can always explore, test out different conditions and see what's working, or you can exploit. You can decide that one of those explanations seems working well. I just want to give everyone that so it actually helps them. So that policy allows you to move between exploration, like random assignment, to exploitation, where you might say that explanation number 1 is helping more people. So I'm going to give that to people 80% of the time. Or you might even do something more sophisticated, like say, well, if you've got low knowledge, explanation 2 and 3 seem to be useful. But if you've got high knowledge, then explanation 4 is. So you can actually exploit by choosing the best, or by actually personalizing, giving people different versions. The key kind of idea behind all of this is this has been designed to sort of meet the needs of many different people. One is practical instructor, or the design of a website, which could be you if someone wants to run studies on your homepage. It can be a psychological scientist who wants to propose experiments and get data back and know exactly what they're getting. And it's also now machine learning researchers who, with the conditions a psychologist proposes, might actually now look at algorithms to figure out, to solve the computational problem of how do we actually balance exploring, figuring out what's working or answering certain scientific questions, but also actually helping users, either giving them the best or discovering how we can personalize different versions of an explanation to different people. I'm not going to talk about the personalization aspect in this talk so much. I've got several future directions and actually ongoing projects that I just didn't include. But I think this is especially exciting for us as cognitive scientists, because in a real world context, you have the scale, thousands of people. You've got longitudinal data where you can track someone from day 1 of a course to day 20. And you've also got tremendous diversity. So as we're formulating generalizations like generating explanations to why helps people find patterns, we might then actually start to ask, well, to what extent are the interactions between that variable, that causal mechanism of asking why driving people to find patterns and features of a person? Individual differences like level of knowledge, individual differences like language ability, or features of context. For example, what particular facts they're explaining, or the activities that they're engaging in at the same time. Now, I just show one example of a microlab explanations because that's research I'm going to talk about. But you can actually imagine that you can basically take any piece of technology, an app on your phone, someone's website, and decompose it into all these modular components. So you've actually got many different microlabs that all then actually feed data into the central place. So it's like a buffet. You could just do this for one, or actually if you have an entire ecosystem of researchers, then everyone conducting experiments is actually contributing data back to the central store and giving a richer profile of people. Could be, and you might actually think now, if you are running experiments, are there any, can you imagine a piece of technology that you use in everyday life? Or can you imagine an online course, because I can certainly help you run that, where by manipulating some of these features and collecting some of this data, you could actually answer the questions you're thinking about now, or maybe even answer questions that weren't possible before. So varying videos, varying text on a web page, and actually even just sending emails to people. It's one of the easiest and quickest ways to actually intervene and do an experiment. There's a formalism that I use to set this up, like there's a sort of if and only if criteria for setting things up that kind of guarantees that you'll be able to do these things. And I just right now call it like a MOOClet on Adapcom. And I have a paper that sort of explains how this works. Yes?
If different people are intervening on the same page at the same time that you're collecting your data, then don't you lose control over what you're varying?
You do. So this is...
concerned that there could be interactions between the person who put the data up there and then your explanation that you don't...
Absolutely. Absolutely. We haven't actually got as many enthusiastic people who are all doing that yet. But I think it's a good question to sort of see as it comes up how we'll deal with it. Just in my experience, when I'm that person doing 20 things on a page, often they're not even main effects. So, expecting interactions is kind of like being worried about drowning in the desert. You just like to find water, and then once you found it, then let's look at interaction. So that's just been my experience, and also in a lot of web-based experimentation, they do find interactions tend to be a bit rare, because the truth is, we know, the public doesn't know. Most experiments have no effect at all. I guess one thing I should add is this kind of way of organizing experiments allows us to go back and retroactively analyze these. So you can basically do experiments where each factor is independent, but you can always go back and see if there are interactions, which isn't true of most systems right now. You really don't know what else happened. I'm just going to flash this. I don't know, how many people here are computer scientists or machine learning people? Okay, all right. Okay, well, that's for you. I'm going to come back to this later, but basically, once you've implemented it, like with this pretty simple design pattern, you actually don't need to know anything else. That's a reinforcement learning agent. You can basically take your experimental conditions as actions. The state space you can think of as basically features of users. And you can actually, in real time, get data and then actually send the policy back. And that's actually what I've been doing in some of the upcoming experiments I talk about. But it's kind of a nice way of bridging the practical, how do you actually set up a system with actually any algorithm you might want to run. Okay, so I kind of made a bit of a pitch here in terms of the topic of explanation learning, but also how we might think of pursuing that through this general approach of using technology. And now I'm going to talk about learners generating explanations. Then I'll cover learners receiving explanations, and this is going to be more of a machine learning application. And then I close on some feature directions. So in terms of thinking about this issue of learners generating explanations, the scientific question I'd like to answer is, well, why is explaining why beneficial? The way that's going to tie back in particular to taking technology and bringing it apart is that a lot of my previous studies were conducted just in a lab context, but more recently I've actually been taking advantage of the fact that you can put this online, where even if it's the same question you would have asked in a lab context, you can now do it on a larger scale, and actually with some more hope that it's ecologically valid. So I'm just going to sort of illustrate one way you could take your current study and move it online. So as I mentioned, this is a question that's received a lot of attention in psychology. and education. And one broad contrast you can make is, does asking why, for example, if I prompt you to explain why the answer to math problem is correct, does asking why help you learn more? Which has been the predominant finding, that when you prompt people to explain whether it's children learning about theory of mind, or adults learning about biology, or high schoolers learning about math, it has significant benefits on helping people learn. It allows them to actually gain understanding that supports generalization and transfer, and it does it even if they get no feedback on the explanations. Just asking that question can actually help people learn. So is that effect or that phenomenon due to sort of general benefits? Is it that when I ask you to explain why, you're paying more attention, or you're actually engaging in spending time? Or is there social context so that you're actually more motivated to think about it deeply in a way you wouldn't be otherwise? The account that I've tested actually focuses instead on the idea that when you ask why, it's actually a selective effect. It constrains your cognition. And the idea here is motivated by theories of explanation from philosophy of science. So we call it the subsumptive constraints account. And the key idea here is that when you ask why, like why someone was angry today, why Joe and Karen spent so much time together, it forces you to interpret one fact as an instance of a broader pattern. So for example, if you try to explain the fact, why is 2 times 2 equal to 4? Instead of just memorizing that fact, which you might do as a student, or just using it, like plugging it into an equation to achieve some other goal, when you ask why, it forces you to try and understand 2 times 2 is 4 because the act of multiplying involves some kind of repeated addition. So even if you don't quite articulate it right, the idea is that it's constraining you to find some underlying principle that fact is just one instance of, and this principle doesn't just subsume or account for that fact. It subsumes a wider range of observations across many contexts. It sort of shows how these many different facts are all instances of the same underlying pattern. So if that philosophical account is correct or has psychological relevance, then the kind of key prediction here is that when I ask why, I'm not just paying more attention, I'm paying a specific kind of attention. I'm actually trying to search for underlying generalizations, going beyond the particular data to some kind of abstraction. So we've looked at this account under a range of contexts and found that explaining why in the context of learning categories does actually drive people to find underlying patterns. They ignore surface features and they find abstract patterns that account for all of the observations they're explaining. And we've looked at this in the context from learning artificial categories to explaining people's behavior, like why they donate to charity, and most recently looking at math problems in online contexts. We've also found that asking why can act as a mechanism to deploy prior knowledge in determining which patterns people discover. And that this effect actually extends to children as young as 5 years old. Even when they ask why, with their limited language capacity, they're still actually able to uncover patterns and generalize. We've also looked at how this actually relates to the process of comparison, which is another key mechanism in helping people find abstractions. Interestingly, with maybe the strongest evidence that explaining why doesn't just increase engagement, we actually find that explaining why can actually cause impairments in learning. Because when people try to explain facts, they actually sometimes discover spurious patterns, or patterns that actually only account for some observations. And what we found is that if you compare explaining to actually thinking aloud or describing, you can actually find an impairment where explaining actually hurts learning. So people get feedback that they're making mistakes, but as long as they're asking why, they keep perseverating on the pattern. So that's a lot of past work, but the question I'm going to look at here is actually, what's the role of explaining in revising people's beliefs about patterns? Because in prior work, we found that sometimes explaining drives you to find patterns that improve learning. Sometimes it drives you to find patterns that might impair learning. And prior knowledge influences both of these. So what sort of mechanisms are at play in whether explaining leads to revising beliefs about patterns versus further entrenching them? To look at this question, we looked at the effect of people explaining anomalies. And here I'm considering anomalies in terms of facts or observations that contradict your existing beliefs. For example, if you think that Joe and Karen spend a lot of time together because they enjoy each other's company, but then you actually hear Joe explicitly saying that he can't stand to be around Karen anymore, that's an anomaly. It contradicts your existing belief. How would you explain that fact? One thing that is found in literature in both education,
Generating explanations.
You can voice them privately afterwards. In literature and education, both psychology, often people actually will ignore anomalies or beliefs that go against their observations that go against their existing beliefs. So this actually is a question then of, it's a particularly important way to see, by having people explain anomalies and structuring those anomalies in different ways, could that shed light on how explaining why actually influences belief revision? And could it actually also be useful in terms of being a process that drives that kind of belief revision forward? So we could find that explaining anomalies has no effect at all. It has no effect right now presenting them or trying to convince people just of their value. So maybe explaining won't produce anything above and beyond. We could actually find that when you explain an observation that's anomalous, it actually entrenches your belief, because your explanations are making reference to patterns or principles that conform with your prior knowledge. So it actually may act as a mechanism to bring your prior knowledge to bear in understanding that observation. So it actually reduces your ability to revise beliefs. On the other hand, we could find that it actually promotes belief revision. If explaining is driving you to find underlying patterns and broader generalizations, then maybe explaining an anomaly will drive you away from an existing belief towards another one. So we decided to look at this in the context of learning math problems, especially because this is the kind of question that requires a nuanced look at some relatively complex materials and the kinds of variation that you find in real-world contexts. Here's an example of one of the stimuli we used. It's basically a math problem from past education research. It says something like, Sarah got 85% in a sociology class, where the average score was 79. The average deviation was 8, the minimum score was 67, and the maximum was 90. Tom got 69 in art history, where the average was 65, average deviation 3, minimum 42, and maximum 87. So after observing an observation like that, people would then be told something like, the university ranked Tom as being a better student than Sarah. So that's now a fact. And most students would just nod and move on. Or they might just memorize it, sadly. What's the effect of prompting someone to explain that fact? That's going to be the basis of these experiments. And just to point out again, this is a nice context because by having people explain these facts, it's again analogous to something like category learning, where you might be explaining why something belongs to a particular category, which was the paradigm in our past experiments. So to provide a bit more detail, the task here really is actually, at its core, whether students can learn to rank people from different classes using z-scores or standard deviation. So if I give you people from one class, history, and another sociology, that aren't really that comparable, how do students actually figure out the way you can rank them? The arguably normative way to do this is to use some measure of standard deviation, or the idea that relative to the rest of the class, someone's doing better than another. So again, that's the observation here. And here's the information broken up so you can look at it more closely. In fact, one reason we chose this setting was because it's a really rich source of existing misconceptions, where we can actually now construct anomalous observations that conflict with them. So Tom's ranked higher. Here's how different ranking rules would be consistent, or how that fact is consistent or anomalous with respect to different ranking rules. If you're a student and you think, well, let's actually just look and see who scores higher. I know it's different classes, but Sarah's got a higher score. I think she's a better student. Well, you would actually have predicted in this case that Sarah was ranked higher than Tom. So the fact that Tom's ranked higher is anomalous with respect to your belief. Here's a more sophisticated idea. It's whoever's more points above the average. In this case, Sarah's 6 points above and Tom's only 4. So again, you think Sarah. So again, this fact is anomalous. Maybe whoever's close to the maximum, but again, they conflicts. In a similar way we used, the true normative response is the only one that actually correctly accounts for all of these. And that's that it's whoever's more deviations above the average. So it's not just the distance above the average, but the distance above the average divided by standard deviation. And so this particular observation is anomalous with respect to those 3 rules, but consistent with that one. In some way, I've started with what's a maximal anomaly. It only conforms to the true principle. But actually, in the experiment, we use observations or facts that were consistent with all of these. The reason I construct these is because if you actually just switch the deviations from Sarah to Tom, then suddenly you can actually explain this fact either using the highest score rule or greater distance or any of these. So in terms of the design of this study, we give people a pretest to measure knowledge. Then they encounter the study items, which were 6 of these pairs that I just showed you that had a ranking with them. Then we either prompted people to explain. So they'd see the pair that you just saw and be told, explain why this student was ranked higher. Or in the control condition, we were told to write their thoughts. Write your thoughts about this fact. And the idea is this is a really subtle contrast. They both involve using language, paying attention, but just one of them asks people to explain why. Suppose ostensibly activating those subsumptive constraints to interpret in terms of instance of a pattern. We also actually manipulated now 2 factors, maybe you can think of as contextual. How many anomalies were there? So we had conditions where there were few anomalies or many. So in the few anomalies condition, of those 6 ranked study pairs, 4 of them would be consistent with all 4 rules. So looking at those, there's not really any information from the evidence itself that would rule them out. And then 2 of those observations were anomalous in the sense that they conflicted with all 3 rules. In the many anomalies condition, they were just 4. So 4 of these ranked pairs conflicted with all of the rules, and 2 of them were consistent with all of the rules. We actually manipulated a second factor, which will make more sense in the next page. But this actually was not just the amount of anomalous information, but how concentrated it was. So if you think about the condition where there were 2 facts that were anomalous with respect to each of the 3 misconceptions, the whoever has the highest score rule, you could actually distribute those facts across the pairs. And I'll show a graphic of that next slide. These are the 4 ranking rules. And in the overlapping condition, what you can see is that the 2 anomalous observations were the same for every one of the rules. So, this might be Sarah and Tom, Jane and Harry, and it ruled out all 3. In the distributed condition, there's the exact same amount of anomalous information, the exact same amount of violation of those rules, but now actually they're distributed across items. So now in the first pair, there's these 2, but it's consistent with these. This is these and these. So just make it a bit clearer. So I'll break up the results into 2 sections. The first is what the effect is of few anomalies versus multiple. And so just to take a step back, if you think that explaining just tries to define underlying patterns or broad generalizable patterns, then you might expect that as long as there's any anomalous information, then simply explaining finds that that fact violates some existing knowledge. So maybe that's just enough for explain to have a benefit, where you might overturn your common beliefs like whoever has the highest score is higher ranked. Most participants held beliefs like that. If on the other hand, you think that it's actually important that explaining exerts sufficient constraints, that you need a wide range of anomalies that will actually rule out these existing beliefs, then it might actually be the fact that explaining depends on whether you have sufficiently many anomalies that people are explaining. So what we actually found is that there was no effective explanation when there's just a few anomalies, but that effect returned when there were multiple. So the idea here is it's not just the experience that drive people towards the correct underlying belief. There need to be sufficiently many anomalous facts that rule out existing prior knowledge for that to actually have an effect. And that's not a reliable difference, but there may be circumstances under which where if you don't actually get enough facts that conflict prior beliefs, explaining would actually entrench beliefs. And I think there's some evidence that in our past studies.
Just a clarification,
Yes.
what's in the y-axis there?
Sorry. Sorry, got cut off. The y-axis is actually accuracy from pre to post test.
So accuracy is defined by whether or not they get the appropriate standard deviation based.
Exactly. Accuracy is defined on whether they classified using the standard deviation rule or not. And that's because the standard deviation rule is just normatively more correct, but also in all the observations they saw. It's the only one that
you're
was.
measuring whether or not they classify based on which of the pairs they get right, or based on what they actually say about how they do it?
Sorry. This is the pre to post, so it's which of the ones they actually get right. So they weren't given any feedback. They were just given ones without a ranking.
So did the stimuli tell people that Tom was ranked higher than Sarah, or was that their job to sort of infer that?
Sorry, I wasn't clear on that. In the pre-test, there was no ranking. You just made judgments. But in the study phase, when I say there's a ranked pair, you got the pair and you also were told Tom was ranked higher, Sarah was ranked higher. So every observation gave you the correct answer.
Okay.
And you either had to explain that or write your thoughts about it.
And the post and the pre-test were independent of the study phase items.
Yes.
Because you say using the z-score is normative, but I don't think it's necessarily how a lot of places work, right? So like in my high school, valedictorian is just based on your GPA, which doesn't take into account how difficult the courses are.
Yes.
So don't people have prior conceptions based on what they've experienced before, and is that really the normative answer? Or
I think you make a good point that it's not unequivocally the correct thing to do, and there might be some other kind of random variation that goes on outside of the study that maybe people are sensitive to. I think in this context, I'm not as concerned about that because there's two sources of normativity. One is actually the evidence you get during study. Because in all conditions, the only rule that worked for all 6 observations was the z-score. Whereas in one condition, there were always 2 observations that ruled out all other 3, and the other condition, there were 4. So the idea is that people have these specific misconceptions about Sarah ranked higher than Jane, and what I think explanation is doing is driving them towards the more normative one, point to prior knowledge, if you understand correctly, and also the evidence.
So I just want a couple methods questions. So assuming randomized order.
Yes.
And that was it. Okay.
Order these study items, right? Yes. Yeah.
And you would have them explain after every trial?
Yes, and we matched the amount of time explaining versus writing thoughts.
And could they go back to previous trials if they wanted?
No, they couldn't. So it's forced advance. So here's the other factor. This was actually, okay. Were the observations overlapping or distributed? And so the idea here is that the overlapping observations were those where even if the amount of anomalous information was matched, they were concentrated on just 2 observations. This distributed was spread out. So you actually might make the argument that the overlapping condition would actually be not useful because if explaining is driving people to find a pattern, well, they've got all of these observations that are consistent. On the other hand, you could argue, and so the idea would be at least on every single observation, explaining would make you spot at least one anomaly. On the other hand, you might expect that the thing that's good about this setting is that when you explain, it decisively rules out all those possible misconceptions you could have. So even though this is kind of evidence almost for those, when you explain these observations, there's no way to subsume that under any alternative pattern. Whereas under this condition, you might just explain this away in terms of, even though this conflicts with the highest score, it's greater distance from the average. Yeah.
Are your participants aware that the same explanation ought to apply to all of the conditions?
I didn't test whether they did, but my impression was that they would be aware of that. most of them would be, but I think that certainly, if I remember the explanation, kind of basic look we had at them, there's a lot of variation. So they might come up with different explanations in different settings, different observations. Okay. So then to kind of sum up this line of reasoning, the kind of key idea here theoretically is that thinking about how explaining impacts belief revision doesn't just depend on the general properties of explanations, interacting with contextual features like how many observations configure prior beliefs, and also even how these distributed, so that they are decisively ruling out misconceptions in a way that actually allows explanation to drive people to discard old beliefs that are predominant in favor of actually new observations that account for more data. I think on the broader kind of point, this is an example of where we're trying to embed an experiment in a more realistic context. So we ran this online with a convenient sample Mechanical Turk, but the materials we used are actually the kinds of materials that students use in classes every day, or that are used in education research. I think using that context allowed us to ask these broader, interesting kind of theoretical questions that really get at more nuanced generalizations, not just explaining drives people to discover patterns, but under what conditions does it. In current work, one thing we're actually doing is embedding these prompts to explain directly into math problems. For example, on the website Khan Academy, and also in MOOCs, actually having prompts that show up above here, prompting people to explain. So I covered a lot of work beyond learners generating explanations and understanding mechanisms underlying that, which I think have a lot of implications for designing technology more broadly. It's really just a piece of text. You can paste that on any phone, any email, any website. But the idea is it's technically simple to add, but it's cognitively potent. Because when you put that prompt in there, it can actually guide people's learning and reasoning. But I definitely wouldn't argue that receiving explanations isn't beneficial. Even though sometimes people are given explanations and they don't process them deeply, which there's educational literature suggests, there certainly is a lot of value to being given explanations for facts or explanations for how to solve math problems. So now we're actually going to switch to a different angle on this issue of explanation learning, which is actually now a computational problem. How could we actually get the explanations learners generate through useful computational work? How could we collect data and get explanations that we could then actually try to optimize and figure out which ones are going to help other people learn? And in particular, I'm going to think about optimizing explanations through algorithms for automated experimentation. Getting back to that slide I showed the reinforcement learning people earlier. The design problem here from a human-computer interaction perspective of how do we design technology and build systems is, let's have a dual goal of helping learners while actually also being able to do useful computational work with the self-explanations they provide and with the judgments they make. So again, now we're focusing on the explanation part more directly. So not prompting people to explain, but actually which explanations will be effective for learners. So this is a pretty different contribution. I think a lot of you are used to seeing, at least it's been for me in the last couple of years since I did HCI work, but I'm actually presenting a system that's sort of built to actually instantiate some of these psychological principles and some of these algorithms. So this is what we call the Adaptive Explanation Improvement System, or AXIS. And the idea is that this is something like a plugin that you could add to any web page or any problem or the class you're teaching that would actually allow you to specify, here's an explanation that I'd like to be improved. How can I have a workflow that's going to get learners to contribute to it and algorithms that are actually going to optimize these for me? The key idea here is we're going to use this abstraction from what I presented earlier at comms to actually build machine learning algorithms into the technology. It's almost a shame that we have these algorithms for doing intelligent learning, but they're not actually built in technology at the ground level. You know, Facebook and Google do this to some extent, but it's not widespread. And in particular, I'm going to talk about real-time learning, not using technology to collect massive amounts of data, but actually using technology to do more hypothesis-driven work, where we're actually actively collecting data by presenting different explanations and seeing what works. Okay, so in terms of the interface, again, an HCI, human-computer interaction kind of question, the learners are solving math problems, just like before. The problems here now are different. They're actually problems like compute the probability of there being 5 heads in a row. If Mary walked 5 miles to school at 3/4 of her normal speed, how long did it take her on Tuesday when she was 50% above average? Something like that. So people see the problem, they enter an answer, then they see the correct answer. That's kind of the way tons of math problems on Khan Academy assistance MOOCs work. What we want to do now is actually have a system that will start collecting explanations and providing them to learners. So after I solve a problem and get the answer, I can actually get an explanation of how to solve that problem and why the answer is correct. So in this, we augment the typical paradigm by a few things. One is we ask people, well, how well do you think you'd be able to solve problems like the following problem? And they rate it from 1 to 7. Then here's the problem. Mary's music store had 5 truckloads of CDs, and so on and so on. Then, Then they would actually enter an answer, be told the correct answer, and then actually give an explanation. So take the problem step by step, and so on and so on. Then they actually rate how helpful the explanation is. So now we're actually getting some kind of signal from them that we could use to optimize these explanations. And not always, but at some points, learners actually prompted, explain in your own words why this answer is right, or how to solve this problem. So now the idea is we've taken a typical math problem setting of, see a problem, solve it, get answer. And we've added this component on it that can actually elicit explanations and then pump them back in. And we have a post-test to measure learning. So the key thing here really, from the front end, this is about how we use psychologically motivated work about supporting learners. So it seems natural that they're making these judgments to help them while also collecting these useful products. Now on the back end, well, what kind of policy are we going to use to learn which explanations work? As I mentioned, the sort of abstraction I've used in developing these sort of mini micro labs or booklets actually function allow you to reinforcement learning. So I think people who know it will get it quickly. I'm just going to give the general gloss. But basically in reinforcement learning, you've got an agent. It's sort of one of the essential parts of machine learning AI. If you're an agent and you're in an environment that has a set of states, there's a set of actions you can take in that state. There are rules for if you take an action in a certain state, what happens, and rules determine what reward you get. So the idea is that when you take an action, you're always trying to maximize some kind of reward, and this is only given to you after the action. So let's actually think about if you take a piece of technology, like your homepage, or like a math explanation, let's turn it into a reinforcement learning agent. Well, the state space here, you can think of as combinations of user characteristics. And just inside the reinforcement learning people, I'm actually just going to talk about the contextual bounded problem where there's a fixed state space. So, for example, if someone's male or female, if their pretest score is high or low, what their motivation level is, all of these is basically a state space. If I get a learner of this kind, what's the optimal action to take? And that's data that would be available in that sort of list of user variables. Then there's action space. Well, in this case now, it's my alternative experimental conditions. And then there's a reward function. So this is essentially what the reinforcement learning agent is trying to maximize. It's taking actions to test out different explanations. And is it trying to see if the explanations get high ratings? Is it seeing if people drop out or not? Is it seeing if they solve the next problem, the next 20 problems? And now, of course, there's the policy. So given a particular user profile or given a particular point in time, what's the best action I should take right now? And this policy is what we're going to be actually changing and learning over time. To bridge to what we normally do, every randomized experiment I've ever done is basically using a random policy where we assign equal weights to the conditions. So it's like, if there are 3 conditions, 33%, 30%, 33%, that's a random with equal weights. You could also do things like 20%, 50%, and 30%. You're still doing a randomized experiment. You can still analyze it statistically. You just have less power to detect differences. The best way to maximize power is equal subjects across conditions. So as I mentioned, I'm in trouble in terms of contextual bandits. That's a way of formulating this problem. So there's several different algorithms you can use for this. I'm actually using one called Thompson Sampling. which is basically a probabilistic approach that basically you can think of it as is reasonably think of it as a Bayesian algorithm, where we're going to set some prior beliefs about how likely different explanations are to help, and then we're going to update those beliefs as we collect data. So in terms of the actual policy, the reward function, the goal of this system now is to, as we're collecting explanations from learners and we have this big pool, we're presenting them back. So what we want to do is actually, at least in this application, I've decided we're just going to maximize ratings of explanations. We want to maximize whether people rate them as useful for learning. In an ideal world, we actually want to maximize people's learning or motivation or something. In this setting, we decided to go for rating of explanations because it depends directly on the action, like the explanation itself, whereas whether one explanation helps learning versus another depends on a whole set of other variables that aren't a direct function of which explanation is presented. There's a lot more noise. So the sort of part that was made one of these MOOClets or microlabs is which explanation is presented. The reward function was actually people's rating. In this particular study I'm presenting, we actually had no state space. So we didn't distinguish between kinds of learners. We just assumed that they were all similar enough that we could just try and maximize. But we have actually got some nice effects about personalization that I can talk about. The action space here is which explanation is being presented. And now the policy is basically going to start off as random. The policy here, if you were doing an experiment, would just be equal weights. If you've got 6 explanations, present them 1/16 time. Here we're going to use Thompson sampling. And basically, the way this works is, we apply this, is for every explanation, let's say you start with 2 or 3, we're going to put a beta prior on it. And the beta prior is a way of defining prior distribution on the, from 0 to 1. In this case, actually, what we did was basically treat each rating. If someone got a rating of 7 out of 10, we actually then added that sort of as an update to the beta, as if there were 7 successes and 10 minus 7 or 3 failures. So basically what we did was, to give you an example, we might have initialized one explanation as having a beta prior 19 and 1. So what that's kind of akin to is a prior belief that I expect that rating to be 19 divided by 90 plus 1, or 9.5. So you start off believing that these explanations are going to be pretty good. What that does is make you explore. So if you think right now is the best explanation you can see, you're almost sure to present it to someone. But you actually have a really weak belief about it, because 19 and 1 is like observing one explanation rated 9 and one explanation rated 10. What that means is that you might start off with that belief, you present the explanation once, and then you actually get a rating of 5. So that updates the beta prior from being beta on 19 and 1 to now being beta on 19 plus 5, 1 plus 5. So the 5 out of 10 is like 5 successes, and 10 minus 5, 5 failures. So that actually quickly switches you over to then going from beta 19.1 to beta on 24.6. And now if you average that together, it's actually more something like 24 over 24 plus 6 is it's more like an estimate that the next rating is going to be 7. So the idea is we basically chose priors that were very weak, so we didn't build a lot of knowledge in, but were actually optimistic. So it explored very quickly. And as we collected data, it did something pretty close to basically averaging the ratings. So we'd start off with 1 or 2 explanations, and as you assign to people, we'd actually be averaging together the ratings, and then these explanations will be presented proportional to what the expected rating was. So the kind of intuitive way of thinking about Thompson sampling is that you are going to choose actions in proportion to the probability that they're the best action. So that's the kind of basic idea. Let's choose actions. Let's not just take the best action and present it all the time. Let's have an estimate of how likely this explanation is to have the highest rating, how likely that one is, and then present them in proportion to those. So if, for example, you had an expected rating of 9 and you had an expected rating of 8, the explanation that had an average rating of 9 so far would be presented more often than one that had an 8. And so we actually could apply this algorithm where every time we got a new explanation from the learner sourcing interface, we'd actually just add it in with this pretty weak prior that said, I think it's a 9.5. then it would get presented, and we'd actually then over time be learning which explanations are likely to have the highest ratings.
So I'm not sure where you call
Yes.
it 9.5 a week prior.
So 9.5 is a very high expectation. You think this is a great explanation.
Sure.
But
So that will push them to actually try it out.
exactly. But the reason it's a week prior is because you could get 9.5 by having 19 and 1, which is like I saw 1 9 explanation, I saw 1 10. We could have it by having 119 and 10, which is more like saying I saw a whole bunch of 9s, and I saw a whole bunch of 10s.
Cool.
So I think I went over
This is, you're using this method because as you're adding in new explanations, you want the agent to actually try those out because otherwise, they
exactly.
won't try them out if they don't have strong values. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. All right. So in terms of, sorry, I think I'm long on time, but in terms of deployment, we actually just deployed this with just 150 people. So we had them come in, start using the math problems, and start collecting explanations from them. Initially, there was nothing at all, so it was like a cold start problem. But once there was one explanation that was reasonable, they got piped in. And then we actually ran this Thompson sampling. And so this is actually a very small number of people, but we wanted to see if it's actually something that works reasonably within a sort of small end problem, like one undergraduate class or 2 offerings of a single class. So in terms of the policy change, what we actually found was that if you looked at it after 75 people, there were about four explanations that each were 25% likely. By the end of the process, after 150 people, there were more like on average 10. And what's interesting is that a few of these had very low ratings, like they presented 1% of the time. But there were actually 4 or 5 ones that were relatively equivalent. So what we actually get out of this is not a single best explanation, but a pool of explanations and a policy or probability distribution over how often each of those should be presented. So the way we actually evaluate this is not by presenting the best, but actually by presenting all of the explanations and then actually weighting them by the probability that the system would present them. So in terms of the evaluation, we actually did separate the system so that we could collect a large amount of data. We presented all of the explanations that were discovered during the system being run on 150 people. We also collected presented really low quality explanations from learners that were specially chosen, and we also presented explanation written by the instructor themselves. So in this study, what we did is we collected ratings of explanations, just like in the system rollout, but with way more people. We also asked them to rate their self-perceived gains in learning. So you might be, I was pretty skeptical of this as a measure, but the truth is in many settings, actually, you just can't get good measures of, you can't produce really good assessments of learning. And so actually, this is a reasonable proxy. It's also just the fact that in a real world system, what is actually impacting learning and what people think impact learning are not going to align. And actually the latter, what people think, are actually really important in their continued motivation. And of course, we also had a pre to post where it actually looked at whether getting these explanations help people learn more. So since this system doesn't give a single explanation, it gives a pool and it gives a probability distribution over how likely each is to be presented. The way I'm going to report results for the axis explanation is actually by taking the weights for all the component explanations and then taking a weighted average, where I'm weighting them by the probability of each one being presented. So if explanation 1 got rating 7 and explanation 5 got rating 9, the probability of explanation 1 being presented was 1%. Probability of explanation other one was 10. Then it's basically 0.01 times 7, 0.1 times 9. Okay, so here's what we actually find. There is actually a significant effect where presenting these explanations does actually increase people's perceived skill at solving problems. So if in this randomized experiment, we actually compared getting explanations to getting no explanation at all, which was the original problem. And so there's actually some benefit to these, even though they could be total junk explanations learners are coming up with. Now, of course, you could say, well, of course, there's an explanation. It must increase people's perceived skill, right? Actually, when we presented explanations from the very early stage, the first few learners generated, it didn't actually differ at all. People did not feel like they learned any more from those explanations than from seeing only problems. Now, of course, what you really care about is this improving learning? And so, oh, crap, sorry. Okay, so I made a mistake in that graph then. basically what we found, this number is actually, this is, okay, sorry about that. Basically, this is the condition where people got only problems. So when they have no explanation at all, their learning gains are something on the order of 4%. When they get explanations from the system, their learning gains actually go up to about 15%. And that actually is comparable to the gains they get when you present an instructor's actual explanation. So this system for having learners generate explanations and using the machine learning contextual bandit to select them, bandit is actually producing things that are just as beneficial for learning as the instructor's explanations.
What's problems only?
That's actually just a mistake I made on the graph. Problems only is when you get a problem and you don't get an explanation. So it's kind of the default state of the world where most people are solving these problems online and they don't get an explanation. That's a mistake. This is actually the score for problems only.
What is that though?
That thing on the end, you'd have to ask my Excel fogged mind at whatever time I did that. Yeah, I think it's actually something I deleted. It might actually be explanations from an earlier policy of access. So after 75 people versus 150, I think that might be it. So basically, there's a benefit of learning above having no explanation at all. Yeah.
Finish your sentence.
Okay, sure. There's a benefit of learning from these explanations above having no explanation at all, and it's actually comparable to getting an instructor explanation.
So the big assumption here seems to be that you can give people explanations, that you can rate explanations based on their own inherent properties, right? So you have a distribution of good to bad explanations. I'm kind of surprised that you've gone that route, since it seems like the real value of explanation-based learning is that you can figure out how people are thinking about the problem and correct the specific errors they're making. But you're not doing that at all. You actually took the sort of the opposite route of simply giving people explanations that are deemed good or bad.
Yeah, I think actually, if I'm getting what you said, you're saying the really ideal thing to do here would be to characterize people's specific misunderstandings and then provide explanations that address those. That's absolutely the best way to go, and that's what I want to do and working towards now. In terms of why we start with something like this, is mainly actually showing that this is at all possible. At least when I presented this work to other people who do work in education or in human interaction, giving learners explanations, that seems like junk. You know, learners, they don't understand. They don't know how to solve it. That's why they're here learning. Why are their explanations going to be actually any useful compared to, going to help people learn? Won't the explanations actually mislead people? So I think this is basically just a very first step to the existence proof that you can actually collect explanations and you can actually use the algorithms to select the best ones.
But this is after a process of filtering out lousy explanations.
It is after a process doing that, but just to be clear, the way it filters out is I don't touch it. Like if you plug this into your system, it's actually learners. We just structure the workflow that's very generalizable so that learners provide data and the algorithm itself is filtering. So I think part of it is, and again, as a computer scientist, you might not care so much, but if you're building systems and designing algorithms to solve computational problems, this is solving the computational problem of how do I basically start with no explanations at all and let learners organically, in the process of explaining and solving problems, how do I get them to produce useful work, useful information that can then actually result in a better product?
I had a question at the individual level. If what's the correlation look like between, if you've looked at this, the individual self-rated goodness of the explanation and the overall increase in accuracy they get?
Okay, so actually, yeah, so I will look at that. I actually finished the experiment 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
So that's a great point. What I've looked at was the general correlation between explanations and self-reported feelings of learning, and those are reasonable. But actually, yeah, that actually would be a very useful thing. I think I want to get more at Steve's point as well of
it would validate
Yeah.
the measure that you're using. Because I was
Yeah.
also had the same similar skepticisms that you were having about it.
I mean,
but-
you guys are being extremely polite. I can tell you the first time I spoke to someone in MOOC research and they said, we asked learners if they learned. I mean, I was shocked. I thought that that was madness. I mean, how can you ask someone if they learned? I mean, there's so much research showing people bad at metacognition, at conference judgments, but I've actually become a lot more convinced. It's not the perfect thing, but in a wide range of situations, it's actually an okay proxy. In part, to be totally honest with you, it's speaking to people in their own sort of disciplinary language. Like, there's many studies that actually use ratings, so this is kind of the first step towards that, and then I think we'll move on to the next point.
But you're asking them a very specific question of whether this is a useful piece of information.
Exactly.
Just different.
Yes, exactly, and that is different. So we modify the prompt. The normal prompt you might see here is this a good explanation? But actually, I tried a bunch of different ones, and what I settled on was this explanation useful for learning? And those kind of subtle things that psychologists love can make huge differences, and other people are pretty surprised when they do.
So, I mean, obviously the system or this algorithm depends on the initial or the set of learners that go into the process. Right?
Yes.
So in a sense, you could have one instructor getting in there, producing a very good explanation.
Yes.
And then that kind of dominates your effect, right?
Yes.
So can you, for instance, show that, for instance, if you remove the people who perform the best in the task and their explanations from it, that it still provides a benefit?
Let me think about that a second. I think that's a great point. Well, I made a bunch of points. I'm trying to think quickly there. In terms of one instructor is dominating, what's interesting is we found that a lot of the explanations look quite different, but they actually get kind of equivalent ratings. So the way this worked wasn't that we had 10 explanations and there were like 2 that were best. Actually, we have a pretty broad distribution where there are 4 that are crap, and there are 5 that all have about 10%, 15% probability. So that's at least what we happen in this simple empirical demonstration. I think the personalization aspect of this is actually really key and what I'm really excited to start moving on. And that's the kind of idea that whenever we run a randomized experiment, we make different versions, but we've got this gigantic boosted set. Maybe some versions are better for some subset of the population. Now, of course, we know that these kind of interactions are actually a bit rare, right? I think actually one reason for that is that often we don't have the power to really detect them, which you do in these settings, but often we don't have a detailed analysis of someone. Like we've got longitudinal data here for someone in a course from day 1 to day 50. So I'm actually really excited about that idea that every time we make a condition, every time we make a different version of content, we should actually always keep it around. We should be pretty Bayesian, that it can have like 0.01% or 0.001, but we keep it around because it might work for some subset of people. And that's what I think would be a really interesting direction. One thing that's interesting that what you said made me think of is, even if I'm doing personalization, I was still assuming that the reward function should be average across everyone. So I was still assuming that the average reward for explanation 5, it could be averaged across, I could get a good sense of whether that's a good explanation by averaging ratings from good and bad learners. On the other hand, I could actually start to do different slices of that. I could say, well, if I want to figure out what works best for low knowledge learners, should I actually maybe use the ratings of high knowledge learners as the thing to optimize? Should I use the ratings of just low knowledge? I actually think that would be interesting. We have sort of slicing up the data that I hadn't thought of.
So you've talked about using reinforcement learning to kind of find and serve up the best explanations
Yes.
for users. Is there any work being done on kind of taking those explanations, codifying them, finding kind of the generalizable ideas there, and feeding them back into machine learning algorithms to provide a sort of heuristic for solving similar problems?
I think that's a good idea and definitely of interest. I think in online education, there's probably something that does something like that. Within reinforcement learning, explanation-based learning, like probabilistic explanation-based learning by Gerald de Jong, I'm sure there's things that tackle in some sense, but I'd have to take a close look at that literature. I think for me, the really key idea here is actually just that we can do, when we do experimentation, we can actually do it using these algorithms. So I think that's interesting. At least my scope has been, how do we actually do automated experimentation? How do we automatically detect interactions and then actually use those to personalize? So sort of allowing us to keep running our experiment, but still actually help people at the same time.
So how do you get around the curse of dimensionality? Because you're using an RL system which the number of actions is going to keep on increasing.
Yes.
Right? And so eventually you're going to get the situation where additional gains are going to become very, very hard to come by.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I quite follow. When you say cursive dimensionality, what are you thinking about exactly?
In the sense that in your case, you obviously have one state and many actions.
Yes.
But as you sort of make it more complex and personalized, you're going to get an explosion in the number of states, actions.
And actions, yes.
Right?
Okay.
So you're going to need more and more trials to figure out what's good explanation or gather evidence about that.
Yes, that's true. Okay, I got you. Okay, so yeah, there are just many ways in which the dimensions grow. I think right now, as long as it's computational, as long as limits on space aren't a problem, because 300 explanations is nothing, that's actually fine. And the reason for that is that at any point, you're not presenting one best explanation. You're not doing like a frequent thing, just saying like, let's test and choose the best. You're presenting a probability distribution over explanations. Now, it's true that you don't have much power to discover, does explanation 2 work for people who got question 1 right, question 3 wrong, question 56 right, who came from Trinidad, who came from whatever. You don't have much power to detect those. What you do instead is you actually just give them the average. You basically average over those dimensions that you don't have enough power to detect interactions with. So in a way, if I only had 5 people who got problem 1 right and 10 who got problem 1 wrong, and I just can't detect anything, I just would actually ignore that variable. I'd integrate out over it. And so the idea is that at any point in time, I'm presenting something that looks reasonable or is helpful based on what I've had enough statistical power to detect, which were the variables that, like, I had 200 people who got problem 6 right and 500 got it wrong. And as data comes in, I can eventually wait till I start seeing interactions there. Thompson sampling handles this really nicely.
How much more content do you?
I think that's it, actually.
Okay, so we can move to the questions, or I
Okay,
just want
sure.
to make sure you had enough time
For
to
sure, yeah.
get to the end of your slides.
Yeah, let me just wrap up then.
Okay.
So I think
Oh, that's perfect. I didn't realize you were at the end. I wasn't sure if there were.
oh no,
Yeah.
thanks. Sorry, that's okay. So in terms of future directions, I think it's really, how does this actually enable a broader ecosystem of experimentation? So I've just presented things that I've personally done, but I've tried to construct this kind of approach, this formalism, this way of designing technology so that really anyone can use it. Also, this idea of a randomized experiment, it's so simple to us. I mean, it's so central to us. It sounds simple. You do an A/B test, A against B, measure dependent variable. I actually think that it's conceptually a really powerful bridge between a lot of different disciplines. For example, I've talked so far about how do we use randomized experiments to test hypotheses about why explaining helps learning, while actually trading them off with helping people, where we're using randomized experiments to test alternative practical design decisions. I've also considered in terms of how do we use algorithms to do experimentation automatically. How do we use experiments to discover what's working for different people and then actually update that? Here's another dimension. If we want to actually think about getting a large number of experts or scientists from different disciplines to come together to test ideas or build better products, we can actually define something like having people generate many different explanations. So instead of learners doing it, which I think was actually not very principled and scientific, someone who specializes in work on procedural knowledge can generate some explanations. Steve can generate some, propose 3 conditions that might test some hypothesis he cares about causal structure. Joe can generate some others that might actually test something he cares about in research, but also actually have to have some face plausibility to the person accepting it. And then we can actually evaluate these crowdsourced contributions through a randomized experiment, through a gigantic mega experiment that is basically assigning people to all of these conditions. Now, as people have raised, that's a lot of conditions. We do have a lot of data, but the way we do it actually is that you basically get subjects in proportion to how effective your conditions are. So if you propose conditions that are having a big effect on learning, then using something like Thompson sampling, a greater proportion of people end up in them. Joe's might have 20% of the population, mine might have 1%, given our past experience, that he was better experimental conditions than me. There's also this very nice, this slide actually has too much. There's also this very nice idea where when we start an experiment, we always put equal number of people into conditions. That's to maximize statistical power. But you can actually think of that as a prior. If we're expressing prior belief that these are equally likely. If instead I have one round of people propose experimental conditions that are meant to be practical or test scientific hypotheses, you have a second round of experts actually rate these in terms of how likely they are to have a benefit. Those ratings can actually be priors that basically then mean that even before we start, my explanations might go to 5% of people and Joe's go to 7%. And this kind of gives us a great feature of Bayesian inference. We can start with priors that would help us converge quickly, but if we're wrong, we can actually then still overpower them. The way I think this is especially important for linking scientists and instructors is instructors are basically, and sorry, there are many of you in the room, when I teach people, when I give them an explanation, I'm doing something very wrong. I'm saying 100% of people get that explanation, 0% get all the other ones I could have put in. That's insanity. I should never be 100% sure of what I'm doing. I could say 99% get explanation 1 and 1% get the others. But I should actually not ever have the belief that this is the best version. So I think this kind of probabilistic way of doing experimentation actually makes it really easy for scientists and instructors to actually take any existing component and redesign it so you can actually run experiments in it, where there's at least some chance that what you're proposing is better than what's there before. And so that's sort of a big direction, allowing, and actually there's a grant that, NSF Cyber Infrastructure Grant that I got with Neil Hefner at Worcester Polytechnic, who runs the assessments, assessments.org platform. Basically, any of you can look at those math exercises and propose experiments. So we're actually now crowdsourcing randomized experiments from people in cognitive science and education. And the other thing that we're now moving to do is any machine learning person can actually propose algorithms and have them run in real time. And I organized a NIPS workshop on this actually, it's coming up in December. But the kind of key thing here is that this is actually now providing a way, an abstraction for anyone to actually test algorithms in real time, to actually optimize experiments that people propose and also helping users. So that's the kind of main direction. Kaggle for education, using experiments to judge competitions. So I here talked broadly about the idea that I'm interested in this question of how explaining helps learning, whether it's generating explanations or receiving them, and also using this as a demonstration of how we can use technology and redesign it to be these adaptive, machine learning-based intelligence systems that also act as microlabs. Whether it's running psychology experiments, machine learning or AI algorithms, or actually just hitting practical design and engineering challenges. I thought about some experiments testing, well, why is it that explaining helps learning and how we can actually revise people's beliefs in an online setting with complex materials? And I actually talked about the computational problem of harnessing learners' self-explanations to actually use reinforcement learning to choose which ones are best. All right, and the future direction is up to you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's any worry that you may sort of reinforce overly simplistic explanations. So you can imagine that if you have a math problem, some person gives an explanation in terms of a heuristic that works for that particular explanation, or maybe works for, you know, even a lot of these types of problems. And so it leads them to the right answer. People say it's a good explanation, and they say they learned a lot. But then when they get to a more complex one where the heuristic doesn't work, they have now a prior about this explanation, so they're going to be more likely to, or less likely to give up that explanation in favor of a better one that's more detailed. So, I mean, I realize it's probably not going to happen a lot. So I think on the whole, you know, the system's very well. But is there any way in which you could sort of account for that?
No, I think that's a great point. Just to make sure I clearly understood, you mean the system learns too early that explanations work well and they're not really that good, or do you mean people get explanations and they're more convinced?
Well, I mean, to use a very convoluted example, you could say, you know, explains a physical event in terms of Newtonian mechanics.
Yes.
And people say they learned a lot, they get the right answer, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the explanation gets reinforced, but then when they get to an example where Newtonian mechanics doesn't apply because they need, you know, relativity.
Yes. Actually, no, this is a great point. And actually that conforms really well to the anomalies experiment, right? Which is if my system was trying to optimize the average rating of an explanation, and it was optimizing across lots of consistent examples, that's the condition I talked about where there were just a few anomalies, people would get an explanation that Sarah's ranked higher because she has a higher score. If I was optimizing that explanation, that would get a great bunch of ratings. Now, the problem is that it's working for those observations, but it's not actually true. There's some future situation where people are going to generalize that's going to be a problem. There, I think there are a lot of actually machine learning methods you could use and combine with domain scientist knowledge to say, let's actually weight the reward function as not just all explanations, but some subset. So for example, I might say, I don't want to choose, I might set the algorithm so it's not trying to maximize the average rating of an explanation of Sarah, why Sarah was ranked higher across 6 ranked pairs. It's actually just trying to optimize it, how it's rated on the anomalous observations. Because on these simple ones, they can all get high ratings. The anomalous ones, they get bad ratings. So we can actually set the reward, the objective function, what's being maximized, to be specific to those items.
So you give the explanations, a particular explanation may be presented along with different types of problems, is what you're saying, and not yoked to a particular.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who supported this. I mean, if you have any questions or you're interested in running some algorithms or experiments on assessments or in MOOCs, feel free to email me at Joe has my name, but you can also Google Joseph J. Williams, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
You're just trying to crowdsource science now and get us to do your research for you.
That's true.
That's
It's true. I am actually, as you do help me do my research, but I'm actually also helping you do your research. It's like an alignment of incentives.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm just gonna, we didn't get a chance to meet today.
Okay.
Couldn't find a time.
Can I
email you?
Yeah, that would be great. Can I just
because-
Google